Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Yom Tov. Hopefully, today we're going to learn Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amid Beis and Kuf Yud Dalet Amid Aleph, so that we will pick up a day. We're a little bit behind on the Dirshu schedule, but this will help us pick up a day. I think we might be 2 days behind. Hopefully, after today, we'll only be 1 day behind. And we pick up with Siman Taf Kuf Siv Dalet. Says the Mechaber, Melgin Harosh Vaharaglayim, you are allowed to boil the head of the animal. You do shchita, and now you want to remove all of the hair from the animal. And the way that this was done, one of the ways this was done, was by boiling it, and that would help, it would ease the removal of the hair. So Melgin Harosh Vaharaglayim, you're allowed to boil the head of the animal and the feet of the animal in order to remove the hair. Or alternately, you could singe it with fire, and this also aids in the removal of the hair. You're allowed to do this on Yom Tov, says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yudches, Molgin Beroischin. This is referring to boiling it, boiling water. Achar Hamalicha, of course, this has to be done after the salting of the meat so that the dam is removed. And this was done Kidei Lahashir Haseyar, in order to remove the hair from the animal. And similarly, you're allowed to singe the animal in order to remove the hair. And the reason these are mutter is because to have a malacha l'tzarech eichel nefesh, these are considered to be malachas that you are doing l'tzarech eichel nefesh. You have to remove all of the hair in order to be able to eat the animal. So this is malacha l'tzarech eichel nefesh. Upashut, and says the Chavetz Chaim, it is obvious. According to the more stringent opinion that we mentioned earlier in Siman Taf Tzadikei Sif Aleph, who holds that even by malachas that are mamish being done l'tzarech eichel nefesh, like cooking, if they're malachas that can be done on Erev Yom Tov without any detraction from the taste or the Einig Yom Tov, then also be Yom Tov, then you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov. So then, my rikan, we must be discussing here a case where you didn't have time to do this maliga, to do this boiling of the head and the feet in order to remove the hair. You didn't have time to do it on Erev Yom Tov. That would be the only excuse why we allow you to do it on Yom Tov, according to this Yesh Machmirim. There can't be any other reason. There's no benefit in doing it on Yom Tov. It doesn't add anything to the flavor of the meat if you do the maliga on Yom Tov as opposed to doing it before Yom Tov. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, the Yadua, it's well known, she'ena miskalkel, that doesn't get ruined im hayamolgoy me Erev Yom Tov if you did it on Erev Yom Tov. So again, according to the Yesh Machmirin, this Yesh Machmirin holds that any malacha that's mutter to be done l'tzarech eichel nefesh, if it can be done on Erev Yom Tov, and by doing it on Erev Yom Tov, there will be no cost to Yom Tov. It's not something, for instance, cooking. If you want to make a fresh roast on Yom Tov, everybody knows that the roast, right, when it comes out of the oven, is better than if you cooked it on Erev Yom Tov. So even the Yesh Machmirin holds, all right, do it on Yom Tov, because there's a cost to Yom Tov if you do it on Erev Yom Tov. But if there's no cost to Yom Tov, if it's just as good if you do the malacha on Erev Yom Tov as if you do it on Yom Tov, then the Yesh Machmirin holds you have to do it on Erev Yom Tov. So over here, if the Mechaber is being matir, this maliga on Yom Tov, according to the Yesh Machmirin, it must be because you couldn't do it on Erev Yom Tov. He had no time. It can't be because there's a benefit to Yom Tov by doing it on Yom Tov, because there is no such benefit. Or the Chavetz Chaim says, to close off Eis Katan Yudches, or there's a simple, very practical reason why you couldn't do it on Erev Yom Tov, because you didn't shecht the animal until Yom Tov. If you didn't shecht it, obviously you can't do the maliga yet. Eis Katan Yudtes. So the Mechaber mentioned two methods here of removing the hair. One was maliga, where we boil it in water, or the other one was umahavivim oisam ba'ur, that we singe it with fire. Says the Chavetz Chaim ba'ur, another method of doing this was not just singeing it with a fire. You could take it and you could submerge it in hot coals. So you stick it down in hot coals, and that has the same effect. It removes the hair. Now we go further in the mechaber. By me, it's near the end of the top line. Avol, so you're allowed to do this maliga, you're allowed to mahavev, you're allowed to singe it with fire. Now the mechaber is going to tell you a method that you cannot do. Avol, however, ein teiflin oisam besid, you're not allowed to smear the surface of the roish and the raglayim with a lime, veloy becharosis, or with crumbled up fine pieces of earthenware, veloy ba'adama, and not with earth. These are all different types of depilatories. These are things which will aid in removing the hair from the hide of the animal. So if you cannot do this, you can't smear the roish or the raglayim with these depilatories, the mischaze ki ibud, because that looks like tanning. And tanning is a malacha, and it's a malacha that's not mutter because it's not done l'tzarech hachal nefesh. And over here, it looks like you're tanning the leather. This is very similar to the types of activities you do in tanning. Furthermore, the ein geizizin oisam b'misparayim, nor would you be allowed to cut the hair off using his scissors. What would be wrong with that? Shenireh ka'oisa l'tzarech haseyar, because when you cut the hair off with a scissor, it looks like what you're doing is you're cutting the hair off because you want the hair. That's not a malacha l'tzarech hachal nefesh. If you're doing it for the hair, that's shearing the animal because you want the wool or you want the hair. That has nothing to do with tzarech hachal nefesh. So that is also usher. Says the Chavetz Chaim, cut and chaf. You're not allowed to use a depilatory like sid. Why are you doing this? Again, says the Chavetz Chaim, kedei lahaser haseir, because these are all depilatories which aid in the removal of the hair from the hide. Says the Mechaber Weiter in Sif Hey. We know that when you want to render meat kosher for eating, after the shechita, you have to, one of the steps that you have to do is you have to kasher the meat. You have to salt it in order to remove the dam. So now, when you salt meat in order to remove dam, there's another effect of salting, which is it's a preservative. It helps to preserve the meat from spoiling. Now, the Mechaber says, Mutter l'maloyach kama chatichais bebas achas. You're allowed to salt multiple cuts of meat bebas achas, at one time. And we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah what that means at one time. Afal pi she'enoi tzarech ela achas, even though you only need one. So let's say, for example, you shechted an animal, and now you cut off you have the rib, and now you're cutting steaks. And you cut 10 steaks, and now you have 10 steaks here. You only need 2 steaks for the Yom Tov Suda. You need a steak for you and your wife, and you have another 8 steaks here. This is not really the best example because you're not going to salt usually individual steaks. But whatever it is, you have multiple cuts of meat. So let's say you have a prime rib. You're going to use that rib for the Yom Tov Suda. And you have other cuts of meat that are here in front of you at the same time. Now you want to salt all of them, but you don't need all of them for Yom Tov. But you still want to salt all of them. One of the reasons is because by salting it, don't forget, they didn't have refrigeration. By salting it, you're going to help preserve the meat. So you want to salt it all. But what excuse do you have to go ahead and salt the pieces of meat that you're not using for Yom Tov? Now, what's wrong with salting the meat on Yom Tov? Well, first of all, it's a tircha yisera. Anytime we do tircha, any exertion that you do on Yom Tov, we want it to be l'tzarech Yom Tov. A tircha yisera that's not l'tzarech Yom Tov, really we don't want you doing it on Yom Tov. So if you're going to be involved in salting multiple cuts of meat, that's a tircha yisera shaloi l'tzarech Yom Tov. Another problem is that since it has the effect of preserving the meat, it's similar to the malacha of ibud. Again, it's kind of like tanning or kivisha, pickling. It looks like you're preserving the meat. And again, you're doing it not l'tzarech Yom Tov. So preferably, we don't want you to be salting extra cuts of meat on Yom Tov. However, the Mechaber says, mutter l'maloyach kama chatichais bebas achas. You're allowed to salt multiple cuts if you do it at one time. Even though you only need one of these cuts of meat. Now let's take a look a little bit deeper what this means. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and chaf aleph. You're allowed to salt multiple cuts, bebas achas at one time. What does this mean that you're doing it at one time? Says the Chavetz Chaim, b'mapoles yad achas. It means, and he brings this down from the Meiri, and he says that the Rosh is also mashma, that this is what bas achas means in the Gemara. This is coming from a Gemara in Beya on Yud Aleph Amid Beis. So, b'mapoles yad achas, with one throwing of the salt with your hand. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, Kegoin, for example. What's going to happen here? Sheyesh kan shalosh chatichos. You have 3 cuts of meat. What should you do? Yanichem zay etzel zay. Lay down the 3 cuts next to each other on a surface. V'yikach melach meloy chafnav. And take a nice big handful of kashering salt. Kedei shir malicha shel kol hachatichos. Make sure that you grab enough salt in your hand that it's enough to salt 3 pieces of meat. V'zoyra aleim bebas achas. And at one time, throw the salt over all 3 cuts. Now, I have to say that I'm a little bit, in looking in the source material over here, I'm trying to discern exactly what it means that you throw it b'mapolos achas. Mapolos achas sounds like what it means is you're going to throw the salt down at one time. I'm not really sure how you throw enough salt to cover the meat so that it should be effective for kashering purposes in one throw. I know from salting meat, usually when we salt meat, we take a handful of salt and if you have a piece of meat that's this big, right? So you're going to sprinkle. You're going to do this. You got to cover the surface of the meat. If you tried even one decently sized cut of meat, if you want to try to do it just like this with one shot and make sure you get it all over the surface of the meat, that's not going to be so simple. 3 cuts of meat, I'm not sure how that works. It could be that mapolos achas in this context means as long as you fill up your hand one time, then doing this all over the 3 cuts is called bas achas. It doesn't mean that it has to be one throw. It means it's one handful. I think from looking at the source material that that's what it means. If this is negaya to somebody, they should ask a shaila. We would look into it a little bit deeper. Generally speaking, even though in the age of COVID-19, you never know, but this material over here is not something that's generally negaya to too many of us. But I think that that's what bas achas means over here. So b'mapolos yad achas, kigoin, sheyesh kan, I'm back in ois chaf aleph, sheyesh kan shalosh chatichos, you have 3 cuts of meat, yanichem zoy etzel zoy, you put them down next to each other, v'yikach melach meloy chafnav k'dei shir melicha shel kol hachatichos, you grab a handful of salt, that's enough salt to cover the 3 pieces of meat, v'zoyra aleim bebas achas, and you throw it on all 3 pieces of meat at one time. And you're allowed to do this even though you only need 1 piece of meat. You don't need all 3. Liyomtiv. Elachas, you only need 1. V'atam. What's the reason why this is mutter? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Shetoirach echad hu toirach, because he's only exerting himself one time, l'chal habasar, for all of the meat that's here in front of him, shaharei molchan b'yachad, because he's salting it all at one time. So there's no tircha yisera over here that he's doing that's not l'tzarech yomtiv. The tircha is one tircha. He's doing the same tircha for all 3 cuts of meat that he would do for the one that he needs for yomtiv. So there's no tircha yisera. Even though he is adding a minute amount of exertion, because after he does that one throw, he's going to have to turn over all 3 pieces of meat, and he's going to have to do another throw of salt on the other side. When you do the malicha, you have to cover both surfaces of the meat, the top and the bottom. So there is a certain amount of extra tircha here because he has to flip 3 pieces of meat, not just 1. Nevertheless, and like I said in the beginning, what's really the problem here of doing malicha on Yom Tov? The problem is that it looks like ibud, it looks like tanning, but really, we paskin that there is no ibud. I mean, min ha-Torah, there is no ibud ba'oichlin. The malach of tanning does not apply to foodstuffs. Tanning is something that applies to hides, to leather, but not to foodstuffs. Midrabanan, we hold that there is ibud ba'oichlin, but not midaraisa. So since min ha-Torah ain't ibud ba'oichlin, k'moshe kasavnu le'el b'simin shin chaf aleph in Hilchos Shabbos, therefore, hekelu chachamim l'mloyach b'basachas, the chachamim were lenient, and they let you do this in multiple cuts in one time. If the reason you're doing it is because you're afraid that the meat will spoil over Yom Tov if you don't salt all of it. So we will matter you to do it b'basachas. Now we go to the Ramah. Let's go to the words of the Ramah. By me, it's 3 lines from the bottom. Hagah. The Yeshayimrim. Now, just by way of Hakdama to this Ramah, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us right away that the words of the Ramah do not seem to make any sense in context. So we're going to read the Ramah, and then we'll dive straight into the Mishnah Berurah, who will explain it. The Yeshayimrim. The Ramah says there are those that say, Deloi shari laha'arim, it is not mutter to make ha'arama. Harama, we've always said, is like a halachically permissible type of halachic trickery. You're not allowed to be ma'arim, rak kaidam achila shachris, only before you eat the morning suda on Yom Tov. He brings this down from the Rabbeinu Rucham and the Beis Yosef in the name of the Smak. Now, what's strange about this Ramah is, what's he coming off of? The Mechaber didn't say anything about harama. The halacha of the Mechaber was you're allowed to salt 3 cuts of meat in one shot. That's not mutter because of harama. There's no trickery over here. It's mutter because you're not doing any terchi yisera. And since we don't want, you're worried that you're going to take a loss, that the meat's going to spoil, we're matter you to do this because there's no issa daraisa here. There's only, it's nireh. It looks like an issa darabanan. It looks like you're doing ibud on oichlin. So if you're concerned that the meat is going to spoil, we allow you to do this because there's no terchi yisera. That's not harama. So the Mechaber wasn't talking about harama. And now the Ramah comes here and he says, oh, you're only allowed to do a harama before you ate the morning meal. After you ate the Suda, the Yom Tov Suda, you're not allowed to do harama anymore. What's going on here? Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and Kav Gimel. There are those that say Deloi shari laha'arim. You're not allowed to make harama. Says the Chavetz Chaim over here. Excuse me, just 1 second over there. Says the Chavetz Chaim, haloshain megumgum. The lashon of the Ramah over here seems a little bit imprecise. The loy niskar ha'arama klal b'divrei Mechaber. The Mechaber doesn't say a word here about harama. So what's the Ramah coming and say you're only allowed to do harama before you eat the Yom Tov Suda? The Mechaber wasn't talking about harama. The kasvu harbe mefarshim. Therefore, many mefarshim write shechaser kan b'divrei Mechaber, that there is something missing here in the words of the Mechaber. V'chein tzarich leimar, and this is what the Mechaber should be saying. Umutter that really the Mechaber left. There's something that didn't get written in here. There was an aspect of harama that the Mechaber meant to write about. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh b'dvaro. V'chein tzarich leimar, and this is what it should say in the words of the Mechaber. Umutter laha'arim, you're allowed to make a ha'arama, v'limloya chaticha, and salt the 1 cut of meat that you need for Yom Tov, v'achar kach, and then after you complete that salting, litay lacheres, you could make another piece of meat, v'loimar, and you could say, bazer ani roitza, you know what, I want this one. So the harama that the Mechaber meant to be matir that didn't get recorded in the Shulchan Aruch over here was, first, the Mechaber told you 1 eitzah. You want to be able to salt 3 cuts of meat, even though you only need 1 for Yom Tov. What you could do is, b'basachas, you could sprinkle on all 3 at one time. Then the Mechaber meant to say, there's also another way that you could accomplish salting multiple cuts of meat. And that is, you could make a harama. What's the harama? Take the minute roast that you want to eat for the Yom Tov Suda and salt it. Then after you salt it, you could look at it and you could say, minute roast? You know what? I'd rather have the silver tip. That's the other piece of the shoulder. So I'll take the silver tip now and I'll salt the silver tip. Then after you salt the silver tip, you say to yourself, you know what? Silver tip, that's a very lean piece of meat. I'd rather have the top of rib. Take the top of rib and go salt the top of rib, and so on and so forth. And what the Mechaber meant to say was, even if you don't want to do the salting of multiple cuts, like the Mechaber was matter first to do it b'bas achas, yesh takana. There's another way that you could salt multiple cuts. By doing a harama. That is, that he will say, I decided I want this other cut of meat. And the Chachamim will matter you to do this, so that you should not refrain from shechting. You're going to say, I don't want to shecht an animal for Yom Tov. They're not going to let me salt all the meat. I'm going to lose a lot of the meat to spoilage. The Chacham didn't want you to do that. They didn't want you to have pizza on Yom Tov. They wanted you to have about kavadika fleisha meal. So they said, we're going to allow you to do this kind of harama if you're worried that they're not going to let me salt fasil misrach and the food is going to spoil. There are those that write, even if the animal was already slaughtered on Erev Yom Tov, so technically you could have done the malicha before Yom Tov, you're still allowed to salt all of the meat using this harama on Yom Tov. Now, that's what the Mechaber meant to say. And that's what the Ramah was commenting on when the Ramah said that there are those that say that this harama that wasn't recorded in our version of the Mechaber, this harama that you're going to salt one piece and then say, now I want that one, now I want that one, and you're going to salt all the meat using that harama. On that, the Ramah comments and he says there are those that hold that you're only allowed to do that harama before you ate the Yom Tov Suda, not after you ate the Yom Tov Suda. Why? Let's take a look at Eischav Dalet. Rak koydem achilas the Suda Shachris, only before the Yom Tov Suda. Because if you're doing it before the Yom Tov Suda, so it's reasonable, because you do want to eat meat for the Yom Tov Suda. So since you're going to use at least one cut of meat for the Yom Tov Suda, so we'll let you use a harama and we'll let you salt all the other ones as well. However, if you already ate the Yom Tov Suda, and you're not intending on eating any more meat today, then you're not allowed to do a harama and salt multiple pieces, even though you're going to cook and eat at least some of the meat. Because we're not going to be matter you to do this after you ate the Yom Tov Suda, because then it's not only a harama that you're using some kind of trickery to salt multiple cuts. Even the first cut that you're salting is a harama. You're really not allowed to salt anything. You ate already. You don't need any meat. Okay, this is like we're going to see later on in Taf Kuf Gimel Sif Aleph, where it says over there, he says you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, the dafka kaidam achila, but the Mechaber says in Taf Kuf Gimel only before your Suda. But after your Suda, and you can't decide, you know what? Shabbos is coming soon after Yom Tov. Let me get a jump start on Yom Tov. I'll put up a roast for Yom Tov. Put up a roast for next Shabbos. I'll eat a kazayas now. So I'll eat a kazayas now. We'll say that it's for Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do that. So over here, if it's after your Suda already, you can't go now and start a salting project if you don't need the meat for Yom Tov. And the Chavetz Chaim says the truth is, even the Mechaber's first Eitzah, right? The Mechaber's first Eitzah, you want to salt 3 cuts, do it b'bas achas. You can't do that after your Yom Tov Suda either. What was the excuse that allowed you to salt 3 cuts of meat at the same time? The excuse was Well, one cut of meat I'm allowed to salt for my Yom Tov Suda, and I'm not doing any Terchi Yisera because the same exertion that I need to salt the one cut that I'm going to use for the Suda, I'm using to salt all 3 cuts. But over here, you're not using 1 cut for the Suda; you already ate your Suda, so you're not allowed to do that either. Sharei Gam Lachas ain't Tzarich Be'emes. The Achrayim reach a consensus and they agree. The Cholzeh, this whole topic, this whole Isser of salting extra meat is only if you don't know for certain that the meat is going to spoil if you do not salt it. But if you know for certain that the meat is going to spoil if you don't salt it, then you're allowed to salt the meat even after you ate your Suda. And you could do 1 cut after the other cut by using the ha'arama by saying, okay, I'll eat this one, okay, I'll eat that one, as long as you eat a kazayas from one of them. If you know the meat's going to spoil, then we're going to be mata you to do this even after you ate your Yom Tov Suda, because we're afraid that you're going to refrain from shechting. However, even that's only mutter if the shechita of the animal was done on Yom Tov, and the reason why it's mutter is because we don't want you in the future to refrain from shechting an animal for use on Yom Tov. But if you did the shechita already on Erev Yom Tov, so that you could have done all of this malicha on Erev Yom Tov, then you're not allowed to salt anything that's not a clear tzarich Yom Tov, unless you salted it before the Suda. Okay, now we go weiter in the words of the Ramah. Let's go by me. It's 2 lines from the bottom in the middle of the line, right by the Ois Cotton Chav Hey from the Mishnah Berurah. You're allowed to do malicha on Yom Tov, even if it's something that you were able to do on Erev Yom Tov. And he brings this down from the Maharil and the Trumas Hadeshen. So the Ramah is telling you over here, even if you shechted an animal on Erev Yom Tov, and you could have done the malicha on Erev Yom Tov, there was no reason why you couldn't do the malicha on Erev Yom Tov, you're still allowed to do malicha on Yom Tov. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah and see why. You're allowed to do malicha. What the Ramah means to say here is, he's talking specifically about the malicha that you do in order to draw the dam, the kashering malicha. The malicha that you do in order to draw the dam out of the meat. You're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Why? Even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Why? Umitam, the reason is, the ima yomolchai me Erev Yom Tov. Let's say you would have done the malicha on Erev Yom Tov. Ooh, hayetzarech achar hadacha shniya lamolchai oid pam sheni. If you did the malicha on Erev Yom Tov, we know that after you do the salting, you then have to soak the meat and rinse the meat. Okay, so on Erev Yom Tov, you do your salting. Then you soak the meat and you wash off the meat. Guess what? Now, in the days before refrigeration, you would have to salt the meat again. And leave the meat in salt until the next day. Because if not, it's going to spoil. V'davar yaduahu, and says the Chavetz Chaim, it's well known. When meat sits for a long time in salt, mefig tam, it takes away the taste of the meat. Oh, so there's a cost to Yom Tov. Lefikach, therefore, so therefore, it's always mutter to salt meat l'tzorich Yom Tov on Yom Tov, even if it's something you could have done before Yom Tov. You know why? Because there's a cost to Yom Tov if you do it before Yom Tov. The meat's not going to taste as good. Va'agabon, and once it's mutter to salt the piece of meat that you need for Yom Tov, mutter l'mloyach sharei abasar, now it's going to be mutter for you to salt additional cuts of meat, either by using the harama or by doing it b'basachas, kevenchu b'basachas, or al yedei harama v'chana. Avo, im kvar nimlach v'hudach mishum dam. Let's say you have meat that was already kashered. It was already salted. All the dam was drawn out. Also, you're not allowed to salt it a second time on Yom Tiv if you're doing it kedei shelo yafsid in order to preserve the meat. And that's usher even if you didn't eat the morning Suda yet. You can't say that that's tzarech lechal nefesh. It's not. You don't salt meat right before you cook it. Quite the opposite. You wash off the salt. And therefore, it's very clear that the salting that you're doing now is is only to protect the meat. And therefore it's prohibited because this is not something that you're doing with tzarech lechal nefesh. So again, what's he telling you over here? The Mishnah Berurah is telling me you're allowed to do malicha, you're allowed to do kashering malicha on Yom Tiv, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tiv. Why? Because there's a cost to Yom Tiv if you do it on Erev Yom Tiv. Therefore, you're allowed to do it on Yom Tiv, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tiv. But there's a difference between that malicha, which is a kashering malicha, and the other malicha, which is a preservation malicha. The malicha that you do for preserving purposes, that you're not allowed to do on Yom Tiv, because you're not doing that l'tzarech lechal nefesh. That you're doing for preserving. That there's no excuse to do. Sharein, yeah, we read that. Amnam, b'leil Yom Tov Sheni mutar lachzor l'molcha yidei sheyarim al kol chaticha loymer mizuach l'machar. If it's the night going into Yom Tov Sheni, then you're allowed to salt the meat again, and you could use this harama that we spoke about earlier, that you'll say, oh, I want this piece, or I want this piece, or I want that piece. V'chein yaseh sheyochal mihen ma'at l'machar, and then you make sure to eat a little bit of it on the next day. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Chavav, you're allowed to do this malicha, af al pi shahaya, even though you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, mikam makom, nevertheless, dagim, when it comes to fish, shehein meshubachin kishamunachin b'melach, which improve the longer you leave them in salt, think herring, right? So you have small little fish that the longer you leave them in salt, the better they are. Indeed, it just happens to be an interesting thing. I remember seeing that the Portuguese fishermen that would go fishing for sardines, they would go out on the ship for 6 months, and they had no refrigeration. How did they preserve the sardines? It was so fascinating to me. They would go out and they would catch all the fish. They would be out on little boats for the entire daytime with a massive reel of string with hooks and bait every 6 inches. At the end of the day, they reeled in all of the line. Then they go back to the ship and they take off each little sardine, and they have a huge table with a frame built around it. They put down a layer of salt. They take the fish, they put it in salt, and they do head to tail, head to tail, head to tail, head to tail, until they do a whole layer of sardines. Then they put on another layer of salt, then another layer of fish, another layer of salt, and it stays that way for 6 months. And it only improves the taste. It doesn't detract from the taste. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, when we come makam dagim, fish, shehem mishubachin, that improve kishamunachin b'melach, as they sit in salt, also l'molchan b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to salt them on Yom Tov. Kishahayo yachal l'molchan me'erev Yom Tov. If you could have salted them on Erev Yom Tov, because again, what was the excuse that we said? We said you're allowed to salt the meat on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, because if you would have done it on Erev Yom Tov, there would have been a cost to Yom Tov. The cost would be that the meat wouldn't taste so good because it sat in salt for so long. But over here by the fish, it's only going to improve as it sits in the salt. But of course, this does not apply to salting the fish when we cook it in the pot. There's no prohibition of salting, only because it looks like tanning. Or if it's a tircha shaloi l'tzarech, a tircha yitzera shaloi l'tzarech yomtiv, masha ein kein bazeh shenoisen l'saycha tavshil. But that doesn't apply to the salt that you put into the cooked dish. Umine dagam arakim, when it comes to soft little fish, hamiskalkalim ki shenuchu zman rav b'melach, which do get ruined when they sit for a long time in salt. Mutal l'molchan b'yom tov, those you're allowed to salt on Yom Tov, afilu im kiran be'erev Yom Tov, even if they were torn open for the salting before Yom Tov, because those, there will be a cost to Yom Tov if you salt them on Erev Yom Tov. And therefore, v'dinon, kemalichas basar lechal davar, and therefore the same halacha that applies to salt to meat applies to these fish as well. Okay, Siv Vav on the bottom of Kuf Yud Gimel Amid Beis. Says the Mechaber, by way of Hagdama, we know that another one of the processes that we have to do to prepare meat for eating is nikur, which we know in Yiddish as trebering. Trebering is removing the forbidden chalev, the forbidden fats from the meat. We have to do that nikur before we can eat the meat. Says the Mechaber, Naihagen lenaker basar b'yomtiv. We are accustomed to allowing the performance of nikur on Yom Tov, afilu nishchat me erev Yom Tov, and that's true even if the meat was shechted already on erev Yom Tov, so that technically the nikur could have been done before Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Chav Zayin, afilu nishchat me erev Yom Tov, even if the animal was already slaughtered before Yom Tov. Now, these are a couple of words that I find a little bit strange in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says this is mutter. The nikur is mutter. You could perform nikur on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. And says the Mishnah Berurah, the chanal, which stands for the chanir le'el, like we saw earlier, le'inyan malicha. We just saw on Sif Hey, you're allowed to do malicha on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov. So too, says the Chavetz Chaim, the Mechaber is telling you you're allowed to do nikur on Yom Tov, even if you could have done the nikur on Erev Yom Tov. Now, the reason I say that these three words of the Mishnah Berurah are a little funny to me, and I'm looking with trepidation at the picture of the Chavetz Chaim on my wall here, is because the reasoning doesn't seem to apply. The reason why you're allowed to do the malicha on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, is because there's a cost to Yom Tov if you do the malicha on Erev Yom Tov. Because you're going to do the malicha on Erev Yom Tov, you're going to have to re-salt it. Now the meat's going to sit in salt for a long time. It's going to detract from the taste. But by nikur, there doesn't seem to be any cost to Yom Tov if you do the nikur on Erev Yom Tov. So yes, the Mechaber is telling you that the same din that applies to malicha applies to nikur. Just like you're allowed to do the malicha on Yom Tov, even if you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, you're allowed to do the nikur on Yom Tov, even if you could have done the nikur on Erev Yom Tov. But the reasoning doesn't seem to apply. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this is true that you could do the nikur on Yom Tov if it's meat that you intend to eat on Yom Tov. Aval shar basar, but any other meat that you don't need for Yom Tov, asar l'nakra, you're not allowed to do the nikur. Va'afilu nishchat b'Yom Tov. That's true even if you shechted the animal on Yom Tov, so that the nikur couldn't possibly have been done before Yom Tov. And why is this aser? Sharei tarechu l'tzarech chayil, because there's a tremendous amount of tircha, of exertion involved in nikur, and this nikur you're not doing l'tzarech Yom Tov. Elim kein reitzel molchai. There is a caveat. If you want to salt the meat, so you have your prime rib that you're going to use for Yom Tov, but you have all the other meat of the animal that you just shechted, and you want to salt it, because if you don't salt it, it's not going to last. The meat's going to spoil, and you can't salt it before you do the nikur. So, if you want to salt the meat, because you're afraid if you don't, the meat will spoil, and you're not allowed to salt it before you do nikur, because by salting it before you do nikur, the taste of the forbidden chalev, will be transferred to the meat, and now the meat won't be kosher anymore. Siman then you could do nikur on all of the meat by using ha'arama. Again, our good friend harama. What's the harama? After you traber one piece, for Yom Tov, nah, I don't want that piece. I don't like the way this piece looks. I want a different piece. And then you'll traber that piece. This is only true if you shechted the animal on Yom Tov. But if you slaughtered the animal on Erev Yom Tov, and you really had time to do the trabering before Yom Tov, then you're not allowed to traber on Yom Tov. Only the piece that you need for the Yom Tov Suda, because, like I said, there's no cost to Yom Tov by doing the trabering on Erev Yom Tov. So you should have done it before Yom Tov. Says the Ramah. V'toiv top line kuf yav daled amad aleph. V'toiv l'shanois ktsas im yuchal l'shanois be'ezeh davar. Says the Ramah. The Mechaber said you're allowed to do the trabering on Yom Tov. Says the Ramah, if you could do it with a shinoi, you should do it with a shinoi. If you could have done the trabering before Yom Tov and you didn't, we're going to be mad to you to do it on Yom Tov, but the Ramah says you should do it with a shinoi. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and kaf ches. The toiv l'shanis ktsas, you should use a shinoi. Dahainu she'yinakrenu b'kupitzai b'kardan. You should do the trabering using a cleaver or an axe. Usually you use a small knife to do the trabering because it's fine work that you have to do. Even though earlier by Malicha we said, even if you could have done the Malicha on Erev Yom Tov, ain't tsar shinoi, you're allowed to do the Malicha on Yom Tov and you don't need a shinoi. Hasam over there, Mishum Dabasa Shishaya Harbe Malicha Mefik Tam is because there's a cost to Yom Tov if you do the salting on Erev Yom Tov. Masha Enken Hacha, but here by Nikor, Ayadeh Nikor Ena Mefik Tam Klal. There's no cost to Yom Tov. Haylan Akre Me Erev Yom Tov. You should have done it on Erev Yom Tov. You didn't. We're going to allow you to do it on Yom Tov, but the Ramah says with a shinoi. Im yuchal l'shanais is cut l'chavtes. If you could do it with a shinoi, v'im yevshalai l'shanais. If you can't do it with a shinoi, mutter afilu b'loy shinoi. It is mutter even without a shinoi. V'afagav dahu yachal asis mi'erev Yom Tov. Even though you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, mishum debenikor leka shum l'sadam malacha. Because really, this that we're asering nikor on Yom Tov, there is no appearance even of forbidden malacha involved in trabering. What malacha would you be doing when you're doing trabering? It doesn't look like tanning. What malacha is there? Elamisham tircha ba'alma. The only problem is tircha yisera. There is no other problem. Okay, this is a good break point. So we're going to stop over here because I have to jump into another shir. Mirza Hashem. We'll pick up tomorrow, but we did pick up a lot of ground. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. I don't know if anybody is following this live, but if you are, I'm about to say a Tehillim Shir. Of course, I would love to have you aboard. Be well.
Okay, Marsha's waiting. She's the only